Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Public Service Commission of South Carolina. Today is April 28th, Wednesday. It is 9 a.m. and we're here in docket numbers 2019-224E and 2019-225E. Please join me in a brief moment of silence. Thank you. Let's take roll. In the hearing room, we have Commissioners Caston, Powers, Belzer, and Jay Williams. Joining us virtually, we have Commissioners Thomas and Irvin. Yesterday, we finished with Carolina's Clean Energy Business Association, and it's my understanding that South Carolina Coastal Conservation League, Southern Alliance for Clean Energy, Sierra Club, Natural Resources Defense Council, and Upstate Forever are prepared to present their case this morning.
Mr.
Yes.
Chairman, I'm sorry, good. I'm sorry, Ms. Thompson.
Pardon me, Mr. Bateman. Please go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, this is Andrew Bateman with ORS. I'm sorry to interrupt. I have one or a couple real quick procedural matters, if I may raise with the commission.
Please.
Mr. Chairman, I learned early this morning that Mr. Collin and Mr. Barron have been excused from testifying in the Kentucky case. So I apologize for the back and forth, but where previously we'd requested they not have to testify today, I am now informed that they are available to testify today. So we no longer require that protection, though I appreciate you extending it. I would also request that ORS witness Sandinato be permitted to present his direct and surrebuttal at the same time. We would request that the other three witnesses be allowed to separate as many of the other parties are doing, though I would respectfully request the commission allow us to present Mr. Sandinato's direct and surrebuttal commensurate, Mr. Chairman.
All right, sir. Thank you very much. Let me ask the parties this question. I know we are scheduled to go until 6 p.m. today. Does anyone object if we went a little longer? Not saying that we will, but just depending on where we are, it may be a good opportunity to get through several witnesses today. Is there any objection to going past 6 p.m.? I want to be considerate of childcare issues or gym schedules or anything you have scheduled after 6. Okay, I'm not hearing that there are any objections, so that may happen today. We may go past 6 depending on where we are. We're also going to take our first break around 10 o'clock. The commission has a business meeting today. We want to make sure we give staff and commissioners enough time to be prepared to go forward with that business meeting at 11 a.m. All right, if there are not any other matters we need to take up before we start with our first witness of the day, Attorney Thompson.
Mr. Chairman, Taylor Spear, Vote Solar.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. Commiserate with ORS's request, Vote Solar would also request to have Mr. Fitch's testimony received direct and surrebuttal together.
Thank you, sir. That's fine with me. All right. Attorney Thompson, you're ready to call your first witness?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. Attorney Goodwin Thompson here for the court reporter. The South Carolina Coastal Conservation League, Southern Alliance for Clean Energy, Upstate Forever, Natural Resources Defense Council, and the Sierra Club called James F. Wilson to the stand.
Mr. Wilson, would you please take the witness stand, sir, and raise your right hand?
Yes. Can you hear me well?
Yes, sir. I hear you loud and clear. Thank you for wearing your headset. That helps us out greatly here. Mr. Wilson, do you solemnly affirm that the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
All right. Please proceed.
Mr. Wilson, please state your full name for the record.
James F. Wilson.
And by whom are you employed and in what capacity?
I'm an independent consultant doing business as Wilson Energy Economics.
Mr. Wilson, let's start with your direct testimony. Did you cause to be pre-filed in this docket on February 5th, 2021? Excuse me. Direct testimony consisting of 13 pages.
Yes, I did.
Do you have any changes or corrections to your pre-filed direct testimony?
I do not.
So if the questions put to you in your testimony were asked at the hearing today, would your answers be the same?
Yes, they would.
And did you also attach to your direct testimony 2 exhibits identified as exhibits A and B?
That sounds correct.
And were those exhibits prepared by you or under your direction?
Yes, they were.
Mr. Chairman, I would move to have Mr. Wilson's pre-filed direct testimony entered into the record as though given orally from the stand.
Mr. Wilson's pre-filed direct testimony will be entered into the record as if given orally from the stand.
And I would, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I would also move to have Mr. Wilson's exhibits A and B as attached to his pre-filed direct testimony entered into the record as the next composite hearing exhibit. And I apologize, I have forgotten what number hearing exhibit we are up to.
It's 17 or 18. 18. So Mr. Wilson's exhibits will be marked Wilson exhibits A and B. They will be made a composite exhibit and entered into the record as hearing exhibit 18.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Wilson, let's move to your surrebuttal. Did you also cause to be pre-filed in this docket on April 15th, 2021, surrebuttal testimony consisting of 17 pages?
Yes, I did.
Do you have any changes or corrections to your pre-filed surrebuttal testimony?
I do not.
So if the questions put to you in your surrebuttal testimony were asked at the hearing today, would your answers be the same?
Yes, they would.
Mr. Chairman, I would move to have Mr. Wilson's pre-filed surrebuttal testimony entered into the record as though given orally from the stand.
Mr. Wilson's pre-filed surrebuttal testimony will be entered into the record as if given orally from the stand.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. One quick matter before I ask Mr. Wilson to summarize his testimony. We had, in accordance with instructions from Ms. Wheat, had provided in advance a copy of Mr. Wilson's summary for the convenience of the court reporter, which he will deliver orally. But I would also request permission to ask one question at the end of his summary, if I may.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. Mr. Wilson, would you please summarize your direct and surrebuttal testimony for the commission?
Yes, thank you. Again, my name is James F. Wilson. I'm an economist and independent consultant doing business as Wilson Energy Economics. Thank you for the opportunity to testify before the commission this morning. My pre-filed direct testimony and attached report address the Duke Energy Carolinas and Duke Energy Progress Integrated Resource Plans, IRPs, focusing on the company's resource adequacy studies, RA studies. My main conclusion was that the RA studies substantially overstated winter resource adequacy risks and, as a result, overstated winter capacity needs. The RA studies use probabilistic simulations of extreme loads and available resources to identify the seasonal planning reserve margins that satisfy the 1 day in 10 years resource adequacy criterion. The RA studies recommended a 17% planning reserve margin on a combined case basis for both utilities, and this was adopted in the company's IRPs. The primary flaw in the RA studies is that the simulations model winter peak loads far beyond any that have ever occurred due to an inaccurate approach to estimating how loads would increase under very extreme cold, for which there is little or no historical data available. In addition, the RA studies used 39 years of temperature data from 1980 to 2018, weighted equally, which includes instances of very extreme cold from the 1980s that have not been seen in these areas or only rarely for decades. This data set overstates the likely frequency of such extreme cold going forward, and that amplifies the impact of overstating the loads associated with the most extreme cold. These two related flaws had a large impact on the RA study's results and recommended reserve margins. My analysis showed that in the DEC RA study simulation, 76% of the loss of load events in winter occurred under the overstated loads assigned to temperatures of 6.4 degrees or less, which has only occurred once since 1996. In the DEP RA study simulation, 96% of the winter loss of load was due to the loads assigned to 10.1 degrees or colder temperatures, which also has only occurred once since 1996. My analysis also showed that the RA studies are inconsistent with the company's recent winter peak study, modeling loads far in excess of the study peak day that was adopted for use in the winter peak study. In particular, the majority of the winter hours with loss of load in the RA studies occur under scenarios where the DEC load was assumed to be 6% or more higher than the value on the winter peak studies study peak day. While other RA study assumptions also appear very conservative and could be questioned, my analysis probably focused on these issues that I have mentioned. My direct testimony and report also made recommendations for future IRPs. The most important was that the companies should study the impact of extreme cold on load and develop a more sophisticated method for estimating the potential impact of very extreme cold on load. This research would be useful for anticipating and preparing for such events, and it would also help in setting reasonable assumptions for use in future resource adequacy and related studies such as solar capacity value. If, after such research, the companies believe that winter peaks may far exceed what was evaluated in the winter peak study, the companies should develop programs for shaving such rare spikes in load. I also recommended that the companies prepare more reasonable high and low load forecast scenarios as required by South Carolina law. My surrebuttal testimony addressed various assertions in the company's rebuttal testimony regarding temperature trends and details of my analysis and other topics. I found that nothing in the company's rebuttal testimony would lead me to change or in any way modify any of my results and conclusions in my testimony and my report. This concludes my summary.
Thank you, Mr. Wilson. I actually have two questions for you now. The first, just a housekeeping matter. A moment ago, you were, I believe, reading from your pre-prepared summary, and you said, while other RA study assumptions appear very conservative and could be questioned, my analysis probably focused on these issues. Did you misstate, did you use the word probably intentionally, or was that a misstatement?
I don't think I said probably. I hope not. Didn't intend to.
Okay. Well, I just want to make sure the record is clear. Could you just reread what was on lines 12 and 13 of page 2 of your summary, just to make sure the audio is clear and the court reporter captured it correctly?
Primarily is the word. While other RA study assumptions appear very conservative and could be questioned, my analysis primarily focused on these issues.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Wilson. Now, just one more question for you. Could you please clarify your recommendation with regard to the company's planning reserve margin in this case?
Yes. And as I've already mentioned, my main recommendation is that for going forward, they should do a better job with regard to the winter resource adequacy risk. But for the instant case, the recommended reserve margin is 17%, and that's based on the combined case. And the combined case is the one where it's assumed that the companies will prioritize assisting each other when in need. There are various other cases described, standalone island cases, but the combined case is the basis for the 17%. And as I noted in my SIR rebuttal, there's a footnote in the RA studies that say that the 17% winter reserve margin recommendation corresponds to and provides 15% in summer. So my recommendation was simply that the 14.5% summer from previous times, which is a 0.5% lower, would provide 16.5% winter. So 17-15 is similar to 16.5, 14.5. And I recommended that if the RA study flaws were fixed, a lower recommended reserve margin would probably result, but certainly the 14.5, 16.5, just a 0.5% lower, would be adequate based on the analysis I have done.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Wilson. And just so we're crystal clear, the footnote you were referring to, was that in this document, which is it's the same in both, I believe, but this is the DEC RA study that has already been entered into the record. It was Mr. Wintermantle's DEC Exhibit 2. And then I'll scroll down and you can just tell me if that's the footnote that you were referring to on page 18, footnote 16.
Yes, it is. And that citation is in my SIR rebuttal too.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Wilson. Let's see if I can stop sharing that. And with that, Mr. Chairman, the witness is available for cross-examination and questions from the commission.
Thank you, Ms. Thompson. Carolina's Clean Energy Business Association.
Mr. Chairman, I'm sorry, I apologize. My camera's not working. This is Ben Snowden for CC, but we do not have any questions for this witness.
Johnson Development Associates.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. Court Walsh for Johnson Development. No questions.
Vote Solar.
Taylor Spear, Vote Solar, no questions.
Duke Companies.
No questions for this witness, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Office of Regulatory Staff.
Morning, Mr. Chairman. This is Andrew Bateman with ORS. No questions. Thank you.
Commissioner questions for this witness. Commissioner Caston.
Good morning, Mr. Wilson.
Good morning.
Do you believe, I guess, the goal of the IRP is to is the goal of the IRP, or maybe primary goal, one of the goals, I don't want to put words in anyone's mouth, to eliminate CO2?
Well, this is outside of the scope of my testimony, of course. I think there are certainly decarbonization objectives involved, but that this is really not in the scope of my testimony.
All right, thank you. On page 5, I guess lines 3 through 12 of your direct testimony, it's as you were actually just giving the summation, it caused me to think about some things, and I want to make sure I understand it. Says your conclusion is that RA studies have substantially overstated winter resource adequacy risk, which you just stated, and that the primary flaw is the inaccurate approach to estimating the impact of an extreme cold loads, extrapolating based on observations at milder temperatures. What do you mean there? Is that your observations or Duke's observations? What do you mean by that, extrapolating based on observations at milder temperatures?
Okay, thank you for the question. As described further in my testimony in fair amount of detail, and I have some figures, the extrapolations used for the RA study used temperatures up to 20 degrees to develop a regression and to come up with the megawatts per degree that we could expect to additionally see. Now that impact is much stronger at 20 and at 18 and at 16 degrees than it is at 12 and 10, as I show in my testimony. If you focus that regression on the colder temperatures, and I believe I used, like 16 below or something like that, you get a lower relationship. So at 20 degrees, as the temperature drops 1 degree, maybe load is increasing by, say, 200 or 300 megawatts for every degree as customers are turning on more equipment and keeping it on longer. But once you get to the colder temperatures, the really cold temperatures, pretty much everything's turned on, and the incremental impact of an additional degree when you're at 16 and 15 and 14 is lessening because customers simply don't have more things to turn on. And potentially also because this is perhaps typically a winter morning very early, and some schools and businesses may decide to open late, and so their loads may also be reduced. So in the Astrop regressions to develop that megawatt per degree, they used temperatures up to 20, and that resulted in overstating it and coming up with a number that they used to extrapolate to the really low temperatures, the 10 and the 8 and the 6, that overstated load at those temperatures. I hope that is a clear explanation. It's a little bit of a complicated subject, but my testimony shows through some graphs and in some detail that focusing on the colder temperatures, which are more representative of what would happen at even lower temperatures, provides a more accurate estimate of the incremental impact of additional cold.
And did you say that this was, you used a regression analysis to do this, or you just extrapolated that from some other information?
Astrop used a regression analysis, okay, and I too used a regression analysis. We both used exactly the same approach. The only difference was they used temperatures up in the 20, 18, 16 range, which are not representative, and I focused the regression on the observations that give us more relevant information.
All right, so are you saying what Duke focused on these temperatures, are you saying that those were, did they made those temperature numbers up, or?
No, we're both trying to figure out how will incremental cold at the really extreme temperatures like 16, 12, 10, 8 will affect load. And okay, to do that, we do a regression based on actual observations, and we're using the same set of actual observations. There are very, very few below, say, 10 degrees. There are few in the 10 to 16 degree range, and then there are many, many observations up around 20. Well, Duke included a lot of those observations up around 20, which I think are less applicable to trying to understand what might happen with further cold at the lower temperatures.
Okay, I understand. And in addition, you say, well, you go on to say in addition, the RA studies used 39 years of temperature data, from 1980 to 2018, weighted equally, which includes many instances of extreme cold that have not been seen in these areas or only rarely for decades. This overstates the likely frequency of such extreme cold going forward, amplifying the effect of overstating the impact of extreme cold on winter peak loads. Are you saying, or at least this is how I'm reading it, that in this 39 years of data, that these extreme colds have only rarely been seen or have not been seen, and it overstates the extreme going forward. Are you saying they should use a lesser time frame, or the time frame's okay, but the numbers aren't accurate? That's two questions, I know, I'm sorry.
Yeah. No, the numbers are accurate. That's the easy question. The harder question is, should a different time frame be used or a weighting? I didn't make a specific recommendation about that. What I mainly pointed out was that using the 39 years of weather data includes some very, very extreme temperatures in 82 and 85 that have a huge impact on the result. And that, you know, according to the climate research that I cite in my SIR rebuttal, the forecasts are that the most extreme temperatures are probably getting warmer over time. So we also have the sensitivity analysis that shows that if you use data from 1990 to the present, instead of 39, you use 29, you get a very different result, a much lower reserve margin. So I didn't make a specific recommendation about the historical period, but the main point is that the first problem that we just discussed a moment ago of overstating the impact of extreme cold on load, combined with this data set that includes some very, very extreme cold that hasn't been seen for decades, the combination of those two characteristics go together to greatly overstate the risk of very, very extreme loads, and thereby overstating resource adequacy risk in the winter.
So, do you agree that this is, the IRP is a long-range planning document?
Yes.
So, do you agree or disagree that, well, that's, let me think how to say it, because I don't want to. When it comes to a long-range planning document, looking at how much water we're going to need, how much electricity we're going to need, or whatever, are you saying that we should use projected data on temperature over historical data on temperatures?
No. Again, I didn't make a specific recommendation about the historical time frame. There may be a time in the future when we have additional research on climate and on climate change, and using historical data to anticipate the future might not be the best way to go. We might want to instead reflect the predictions of climate research. And as I cited in my SIR rebuttal, the US government's National Climate Assessment says that the most extreme winter cold, the 1 in 10 year winter cold, is getting warmer over time. So there may be a time when it's appropriate to reflect that research, but I think maybe we aren't there yet. And of course, it's a conservative assumption to use historical data rather than projected future data. And we've always assumed that the best way to project future weather was with historical weather, because it's really only recently that we're starting to take more and more seriously the notion that there will be substantial changes in future weather relative to past weather.
So, if I'm understanding you correctly, while you're not choosing time frames or decades or anything like that. You think for a long-range planning document for infrastructure generation, whatever, it may be wiser to use projected data rather than historical data.
I believe I said that the time may come when the best way to estimate for the purposes of modeling the future, future resource adequacy requirements, future loads, and the temperatures that drive them, the time may come when simply using historical data may not be the most accurate way to do that, that we may need to take into account that there are some trends in the historical data, that trends that we expect will continue into the future. That should certainly be considered, I think, in any future IRP. I'm not saying that that's the way to go, but I think that definitely at this time warrants consideration.
I'm certainly not trying to put words in your mouth, but if I understood what you said, it almost sounds like you're saying that there may come a time in the future when we're looking at trends relative to temperature, and I assume temperature's increasing. That still sounds to me like sometime in the future we're going to be looking at the past to determine that future. Did I misunderstand what you just said?
Well, I think under any circumstance, for modeling the future, we have to come up with a data set that says, you know, how high can winter peak loads be in, 2024? We've got to come up with a way to do that. How high can they be and how likely? And we use historical temperature and load data to come up with that simulation. Now, over long-standing practice in many, many places, we use a large number of historical years to create a data set for that purpose. And we don't capture any trends typically in that data set because we have always historically, up until recent years, assumed that there really aren't trends in weather data. But what I'm saying, we will still be using historical data, I think, in any case. The question at hand is, if we do start to discern trends in the historical data, do we project those trends in order to develop our data set for the future or not? And what I'm saying is, I think the time has come that for any future study, it warrants serious consideration of whether the trends in the historical data ought to be acknowledged and reflected for the purposes of creating the data set to model future conditions.
I understand. In my former role, I used to, be greatly concerned about planning, especially when it came to looking at water supplies. Anybody with money can build treatment plants and such. Typically doesn't, it takes a period of time, but not an extreme period of time. But I was always concerned about 100 years from now, will we have adequate water supplies? Because short-term decisions can matter. So one of the things I had to do was determine how to do that. What's the best way to do that? What were the different methodologies, different studies? And I came across in my planning and different discussions I'd had with different folks of looking at not just the last few decades that we had stream gauge recording information, because typically that's what our planning, at least in the water sector and wastewater sector, was based on, those stream gauge staging, 7Q10s and such as that. but it's, in the grand scheme of things, such a short window. So are we looking at it right? And what I understood you to say, and I think some of the folks yesterday to say, the inputs are what's so important in any study, any planning process, the inputs. And when it comes to information such as this, whether we're talking about temperatures, quantities of water, what, the bands that we're talking about, are we talking about the last 10 years, last 20 years, 30-year increments, 100-year increments? So started looking at paleoclimatology, which included a lot of things, dendroclimatology and archaeological results. And there were some significant things I discovered, significant, that indicated that our last 86 years of data, now probably closer to 100, were very inadequate. In dealing with, actually at the time, state climatologist, talking about those things, I was told, right or wrong, that if it has happened before, it will happen again, but only worse. Meaning, whether it's a drought, whether it's a heat wave, whether it's a cold spell, do you agree with that or disagree with that statement?
Well, from a probabilistic sense and allowing geological time, I can probably agree that if it happened again, it will happen again at some point. But you know, that could be many thousands of years into the future. I mean, certainly our climate, if you go way back, has been extremely different from what we've seen over the last, 20, 30, 40, 60, 80 years. There's no question about that. But typically in these studies, it really doesn't matter whether you use 20 or 30 or 40 or 50 years of historical weather data. Typically, in putting one of these studies together, you pick a historical period and you do a little bit of a sensitivity analysis, and it almost always shows that it really doesn't matter, that the weather has been reasonably consistent over historical time, that it really doesn't change your results whether you use 20 or 30 or 40 years, because the patterns have been pretty consistent over time. But what we find in this study is it does matter, because you've got some very extreme temperatures, as we've discussed, in the 80s, which really haven't been seen since. So your desire in setting up one of these studies is to pick enough historical data that you're pretty confident that it represents the range of extremes that we ought to look for going forward. And some sensitivity analysis ought to confirm that. But the other thing I want to point out is 1 day in 10 years. These are probabilistic studies. We're not planning capacity for the most extreme thing that could ever happen, including going back to, Paleolithic times. We're not planning to meet that. We're planning that 1 day in 10 years, maybe that'll be the time, when we don't quite have enough capacity. Now, as a practical matter, planning for 1 day in 10 years, that 1 day in 10 years usually comes much less frequently than 1 day in 10 years. If we look across the country at all the many utilities planning for 1 day in 10 years, and we ask them, have you seen 1 day in 10 years? No, in most cases it's less. There are, of course, a few very well-known examples where that day did come, but for the most part, it's conservative probabilistic analysis.
So in that probability, and I agree with that. In essence, everything does boil down to that. In that probability analysis, as far as long-range planning, because when it comes to this kind of infrastructure, this kind of money, and these kind of things, it's going to be best not to guess wrong or underguess or greatly overguess. But what probability do you think for long-range planning should be used? 2%, 5%, 10, 20?
Well, that's kind of an imprecise question, and ultimately you have to trade off the millions that you're spending for additional, insurance or whatever you call it, against the extremely low probability that it may be used. But in something like an RA study, it is intended to be a probabilistic analysis to calculate the probability of running short on load. So whereas in a planning context, we want to be conservative, we want to add a margin, for a lot of planning of different systems, we take a deterministic approach and we want to make sure it's enough and we add a little margin. The RA studies are intended to be probabilistic analyses, so they should be unbiased. If we're going to introduce conservative planning decision-making, that shouldn't be embedded in the RA study. The RA study should give you an honest 1 day and 10-year prediction. The conservatism should be reflected in the planning choices and system expansion choices that are recommended and approved based on such studies. That's my view.
Well, relative to the probability, at least the way I viewed it in the planning process when we were looking at, say, long-range water supplies, and it boiled down to a policy decision. Do we want to figure, say, a 2% probability that the drought or supply, a multi-decadal issue, will occur 2% or less of the time over the life of this, or 5%? I mean, that mattered. I mean, we could look at the past, but in essence, what we're really talking about is what is the probability this will happen in this period of time? Not will it ever happen again. Do you agree?
Yes, I agree. The key question is how likely it is. And if you have a estimate of the probability like that you're fairly confident with, then you can proceed to do the sort of cost-benefit analysis that should underline any decision of, whether you do the investment to, if you can spend $1 billion to reduce that 2% to 1%, but you think that 1%, that the impact on consumers, isn't really that horrible, then you probably wouldn't spend the $1 billion. But if it's 100 million, you might be happy to spend it and reduce that 2% risk to 1%. So ultimately, I think it's cost-benefit analysis, either explicit or implicit, that drives the decision of whether 2% is right or 1% is right or 0.1 or 10.
Okay. And when I mentioned paleo and dendroclimatology, I know that kind of sounds like Jurassic Park, maybe, to some, and I did not mean to imply that. Although, when I was looking at studying this stuff, there was a Dr. Stahl and others that had done a lot of work in the dendroclimatology, the tree ring data, old growth trees. Matter of fact, 2 of those trees used in their study were just right across the lake from me in Clemson's experimental forest, which was very interesting, I thought, and I think some down around the Beaufort area. And oddly enough, some of those studies actually indicated in the, I think, 1500s. And there was some link to, and this was the archaeological side, because there was some diary information and everything from Sir Walter Raleigh's lost colony. And there was actually a colony that packed it in, a Spanish colony down around the Beaufort Port Royal area back in the 1500s that specifically talked about the heat and the extreme conditions, how dry it was, which coincided with that dendroclimatology. And when I say multi-decadal, that's where those bands come in. If you look at any 10 years or any 20-year period, a 30-year period, you get certain information in that band that could lead you to a conclusion that, well, heck, that doesn't look so bad. But then if you add this band, or look at the band from here to here, the 50-year band, things change. For example, I think in South Carolina, the average rainfall was about 58 inches. I can't remember what it was, some amount of inches when you looked at that band. But then when you looked at the additional 20 years, the additional 40, it starts dropping. So these things aren't from it didn't rain much for 3 months or this year, but they were multi-decadal, which indicated over the course of 100 years, the average rainfalls were dropping all over North America. Temperatures were rising. And it mattered. So would you agree that the bands or time widths you look at do matter when you're trying
yes.
to go ahead?
Yeah, they definitely matter. I mean, if we started with preparing the model, if we used at first, say, a 5-year historical data set, and we ran the model and got some results, and then we said, well, let's consider using 10 years of historical weather data, we would almost certainly get a very different result. And around the country, you won't really find anybody using 5 or 10 unless, you know, they have to, because that's all they have for whatever it is they're trying to model. Much more common is 20 or 30 years. And as I described earlier, you really hope that your exact choice doesn't matter to the results, to whatever it is you're trying to model and predict. So if you use 20 and if you add 10 more 30, you get the same answer. You add 10 more 40, you get the same answer. Then you're pretty confident that your model is robust, not sensitive to that decision, and you use 20 or 30 or 40, whatever, and it really doesn't matter. If it is sensitive, then you have a bit of a problem because you got to choose which time frame to use. I'm pretty confident that as you keep adding and go back 50, 60, 70 years, that you'd probably get to that stable place where your historical data set doesn't matter too much. Although, as you go further back, you're also starting to get a data set that probably embeds some trends, and maybe you should give attention to those trends. But yes, the historical period does matter, but again, you hope to make a choice so that for exactly what you're doing, you've made a choice so that it doesn't matter very much.
I agree. Part of my research also indicated, I think it was mid-1600s to maybe the first quarter part of the 1700s, there was extreme cold. Matter of fact, I think they called it the Little Ice Age, Mini Ice Age or something, you know, Washington crossing the Delaware painting. Do you agree with that?
Oh, yes, and centuries ago, there have been very different conditions. I mean, I think we hope that those very different conditions don't just sort of drop on us suddenly out of nowhere. I think that, and I'm out of my expertise here, but I think that times like those come and go kind of over very long time frames. They don't just sort of drop in one day suddenly, so that if we were going back to a mini ice age, we would have decades to see it coming and to prepare, rather than it just sort of showing up one day probabilistically.
Good. Let me ask you this, because also part of my studies, I really got into this stuff. I don't know if you know, and I had the opportunity to back then talk to some of the NOAA folks about how we do look back in the past, even further back. And they were talking about doing these, you know, ice cores, I think, in Antarctica, depending on how deep you go, you know, it might give you a rough idea of the, I guess, time frame. and then depending on the depth, they would extract the gases from that ice that dissolved and, you know, see what it was like back in those days. Are you familiar with that?
I've heard a little bit about that. I'm an energy economist mainly, so I mean I think everyone's interested in these studies and this type of research because every now and then we hear of things that are very troubling coming from this kind of research. You know, the Antarctic ice is one that always attracts my attention. So I'm not very knowledgeable about that, but I know that a lot of that research is going on, and the results seem to be increasingly troubling over time.
Well, one of the things, and thank you, I'm where you are. One of the things I ask him is like, okay, on the continuum of the last 100,000 years, and I can't remember the years I gave him, say, from, you know, 1000 AD to, you know, 1000 BC, you know, what was occurring then, what was going on. And he mentioned he couldn't do it with precision. But I asked this, in essence. Is there the possibility in, say, the last 100,000 year continuum that if we could know, if we could have the data, if we'd had instrumentation set up 100,000 years ago, would there have been maybe similar periods of time, whether it's this decade, previous decade, or whatever, where there were similar events, similar trends in the last 100,000 year continuum? Do you agree with that?
Well, it'd be wonderful to have that data for sure. However, I think that if we really did have it and we had all of the related information so that we could understand what was driving the trends at that time, I think that ultimately for the practical purposes at hand, for instance, of doing an RA study and wanting to model how cold it could get and how high loads could be in North Carolina and South Carolina in 2025, I think that ultimately we would decide that using 20, 30, 40, or 50 years of historical data was the best way to go, that that very, very deep history did not inform what's likely to happen in the very near future. From the perspective of that time, 2025 is very near future. And even 2040 is very, very near future.
But you do agree that the RRP is a planning document that is considering long-range planning?
Yes.
And the decisions made in this document, whatever those scenarios are, hypothetical scenarios, one's existing in hypothetical scenarios, that the decision made or this commission makes will have not only long-term repercussions, but significant financial impact. Either way, do you agree with that?
I agree to some extent. A lot of the decisions can be reevaluated on a year-by-year basis. So some of the decisions may be like, you know, go, no go on a very major capacity addition. You know, it may be difficult to revisit something like that. Others that may affect the extent to which you're reducing carbon output in the near term have very long-term impacts potentially, but you know, the impact of the near-term decisions on that may be very small. So I agree, but let's also recognize that we're revisiting the choices on a year-by-year basis to some extent, potentially, depending on new information that becomes available.
Thank you, Mr. Wilson. You've been very gracious, and I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you. Very interesting questions.
Any other commissioner questions for this witness?
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, this is Commissioner Thomas.
Commissioner Thomas, I heard Vice Chair Belzer first, and you will be right after Vice Chair Belzer. Vice Chair Belzer?
Thank you.
Good morning, Mr. Wilson. Thank you for your appearance this morning and for your testimony. I just had a couple of things. In your discussion with Commissioner Caston, you used a phrase, pick enough historical data. I reckon my question about the appropriate term to use or the number of years to use in these analyses, is there an industry standard for the appropriate range of years? Who makes the decision on whether it should be 40 or 20 or 30 or 100?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, again, the goal of the analysts making that decision should be that they pick a number that doesn't matter. In other words, I think 30 years and 20 years are very common amounts of historical data. And if you put that into the analysis you're doing and you see that going from 20 to 25 to 30 doesn't change the recommendation, and that's the usual result. The usual result is it's not sensitive, it doesn't matter. Then you pick, 20 or 25 or 30, it doesn't matter. And you, in your analysis, you state that you tested the sensitivity of that historical period choice and it didn't matter, and everyone can just not talk about it in the resulting hearings. But what we have here is a case where it was very sensitive. We saw that data from 1990 rather than data from 1980 made a big difference to the results, and that's troubling because the 1980s scooped up just a very few days, hours really, that changed the whole result, and that's really troubling. So the goal is that it doesn't matter, and if it does matter, then you really would rather do some more research and maybe consider trends in the data and that sort of thing.
Okay. Thank you.
That's not a real satisfying choice, but in the vast majority of instances, something like 20 or 30, maybe 40 years are used, or those numbers are common. I think 30 is probably the most common that I've seen. And it doesn't really matter if they'd picked a little more or a little less, it wouldn't have changed anything.
Okay. Thank you for that explanation. I appreciate it. Mr. Chairman, that's all.
Commissioner Thomas?
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Wilson. I'm just going to try to bring this to something that I can understand. So I believe that you said that when the temperature drops from 20 degrees to 19 degrees, that creates a bigger spike or peak than if you go down into the negative degrees. I think you used -16. So I think what I heard you say is that once you get that cold, everything's already turned on. So there really can't be any more of a peak or a spike. Is that more or less correct?
No, not quite. I mean, approximately. I mean, we're working with historical data, and unfortunately, we don't have very much historical data for under 10 and under 8 degrees. So we're working with historical data, and we're doing regressions, and the regressions show that megawatt per additional degree is larger at 20 and 18 and 16 than it is at 12 and 10 and 8. That's what my testimony shows. When I focused those regressions on colder temperatures, I got a lower estimate of megawatt per degree. Now, my suggestions that that's because people have already turned everything on, that's my speculation of why the data suggests that that relationship weakens at colder temperatures. To me, it's logical that the relationship is weaker at colder temperatures for those reasons. But I'm not basing my view on that on those speculations. Those are potential explanations. My view on it is based on my analysis of the data as described in my report.
Okay. I think I understand that, but I guess what I'm thinking is that in this general area, in my personal experience, we do have a fair number of those days when it drops into the low 20s and into the high teens, and from 30 to the high 20s, and those sorts of drops do create spikes and peaks, and usually when the temperature is dropping, it just goes down lower and lower. So in order to even think about being ready for that 10-degree day, then you already have to have prepared for that 20-degree day. You have to be prepared for what typically happens around here more often, which are those drops in the low 20s. And again, if I'm understanding what you're saying, those are the time frames when we're seeing the biggest spikes in demand. Is that reasonable?
Oh, yes, I agree. When you get down into the 20s and to the teens, you're seeing loads increase sharply with each incremental degree. But the issue at hand with the RA studies is that we want to model what's going to happen with loads when they get down to temperatures which, really happen like once or twice or a few times in 40 years. We're modeling some temperatures that we haven't seen since the 1980s. So how do we assign a load to a temperature where we have no data? And what we're doing is we're extrapolating. So we're saying that, between 18 degrees and 16 degrees, maybe load typically increases 500 megawatts. Well, does that mean as we go from 16 to 10 to 6, that it should be, 5 times that, another, 2,500 megawatts? And what I believe the data shows based on my analysis is that incremental megawatt per degree, it's still positive, but it's not as strong as it was in the 20, 18, 16, 14 degree range.
Okay. I think we're trying to say the same things. Maybe you're doing a much, much better job of it than I am, but I think I have at least some basic understanding, and I just wanted to make sure. I do appreciate that. Thank you. That's all I have.
Thank you.
Any other questions for this witness?
Chairman, I have just a couple of questions for the witness.
Commissioner Urban?
Thank you. Appreciate your testimony today, Mr. Wilson. I know we're really kind of looking at the company's vacuum for Long Island.
Commissioner Urban?
Yes, sir.
We're having some trouble hearing you in the hearing room, sir. I'm not sure if it's your connection or the microphone.
May need to log off and come back on. Is it still garbled?
Yes, sir. It sounds as if you're underwater.
I tell you what, I'll log off and come back. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, this is Attorney Thompson. I can't see you on the screen. I had a question while we were waiting for Commissioner Urban. Oh, here we go.
Any better now?
Yes, sir. Perfect.
Great. Thank you.
But before you proceed, Commissioner Irvin, Attorney Thompson had a question.
All right.
Oh, I'm sorry, Commissioner Irvin and Mr. Chairman, I apologize. I thought it might take a little while for Commissioner Irvin to get reconnected. I just wanted to inquire, Mr. Chairman, I know you had mentioned breaking at 10 for the commission's, to prepare for the commission's business meeting. I just wanted to inquire what the commission's plans are at this time.
I think commissioner questions are close to ending. Do you anticipate a substantial redirect?
No, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Okay. Yes, ma'am. Commissioner Irvin, please proceed.
Thanks, sir. As I was trying to say earlier, our analysis for the purposes of the IRA should also consider that the two companies are not sequestered on an island, but they do in fact have agreements with adjoining jurisdictions for sharing when you have peak demand. That would be true, wouldn't it?
Yes, that's correct.
And so that has to be taken into consideration too, doesn't it?
Yes, and the RA studies do reflect that to some extent.
Good. Did you consider it in your evaluation?
I didn't. Yes, it's the RA studies reflect that. I questioned some of the, I think some of those assumptions are rather conservative in a data request. I gave a little more detail about some of those details that I thought were conservative, but I didn't address it in detail I didn't address it in my report or my testimony.
I understand. All right. Would you agree that the overwhelming majority of environmental scientists believe that we are in a trend of global warming, and that is also confirmed by the recent data set, which is not a part of the 20 or 30-year look back? Would you agree with that?
Well, this is outside of the scope of my expertise or testimony, but as someone who reads the front page of the newspaper, I guess I would agree.
Well, according to the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, 2019 was the second hottest year on record for our planet. But 2019 is not a part of the look back. We only go up to 2018, correct?
Yes.
And then the 9 of the 10 warmest years on record occurred during the last decade. So does that not indicate to us, if we're looking at sensitivities, that the Earth is warming, and it's warming at a rate that's unprecedented in terms of recent history? Would you agree with that?
Yeah. Yes. That's what I've been reading too. Yes. Unprecedented in recent history.
Right.
Again, if we go back to thousands and thousands of years, we've got some very extreme climate situations, but it's unprecedented. Yeah.
That's correct. So, Mr. Chairman, those were the points that I wanted to make, and thank you for allowing me to. I'm through. Thank you.
No problem, sir. Any redirect?
No, thank you, Mr. Chairman. No redirect.
All right, let's see. We're in recess until 1 o'clock.
Pardon me, Mr. Chairman. May Mr. Wilson be excused, or?
Yes, ma'am. I'm sorry. Mr. Wilson, you may step down. Thank you for your testimony.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.